In the winter of 1940, before the world fully understood the scale of the Battle of the Atlantic, Royal Navy patrol reports began documenting a pattern of encounters that rarely reached official communiques. Tucked between routine notations, weather conditions, escort assignments, fuel consumption, were brief, carefully worded lines hinting at events crews struggled to explain. These fragments, preserved in marginal notes and after-action memos, form the first layer of a larger mystery buried within the Admiralty's wartime archives. The struggle of the early war months was unmistakable. German U-boats, operating from bases in occupied Norway and later the French Atlantic coast, were hunting British merchant convoys with alarming success. The Royal Navy's 2nd Battle Squadron, including elements stationed at Scapa Flow, was tasked with expanding anti-submarine patrols across the Norwegian Sea. Crews aboard vessels such as HMS Vimy and HMS Walker faced bitter Arctic winds, freezing spray on deck, and sudden contact alarms that often came without visual confirmation. The Admiralty's desire to maintain morale meant that many unsettling encounters remained confined to internal reports. One such note, filed by a navigator aboard HMS Vimy, reads, "Contact at 0430. Hydrophone trace irregular. No silhouette sighted. Engine signature inconsistent with U-boat type WWII." Though the entry is brief, its tone reflects the uncertainty that plagued early war patrols. Type WWII submarines, then becoming the backbone of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet, had acoustic signatures well known to British listeners trained at the anti-submarine school in Tobermory. Anomalies were rare enough to warrant attention, yet common enough in those years to be labeled simply as irregular traces. Historical context deepens that ambiguity. In early 1940, the Royal Navy lacked comprehensive intelligence on the evolving German submarine program. Bletchley Park had not yet fully penetrated Enigma naval communications, and Admiralty analysts were forced to rely on partial intercepts, reconnaissance photography, and crew testimonies. Many of the earliest patrol logs reflect this uncertainty, entries noting possible U-boat shadowing or unconfirmed wake disturbance, observations that spoke more to the tension of the environment than to any confirmed threat. Still, the phrasing used in several reports suggests that experienced officers believed something unusual was happening beneath the surface. One patrol log from HMS Walker mentions an unexpected hydrophone cutoff, an abrupt loss of acoustic contact that did not match known U-boat evasive maneuvers. The ship's captain noted, "Evasive behavior atypical. Possible rapid descent." At the time, British intelligence believed German submarines struggled with deep diving capabilities, especially under pressure in the frigid northern waters. If accurate, these reports challenged established assumptions and raised questions that the Admiralty chose not to publicize. The concern was clear. Acknowledging unknown enemy capabilities could have caused unnecessary fear among merchant crews and the public. The reveal, however, comes not from dramatic confrontation but from the pattern of these marginal notes over several months. Reports from separate vessels, operating in different sectors of the Norwegian Sea, echoed similar language, unusual hydrophone readings, incomplete contacts, or acoustic traces that vanished quicker than expected. Nothing within the report suggested anything beyond human or mechanical cause, yet they pointed to either an underestimated German tactic or early war misinterpretations by fatigued crews working in brutal conditions. Admiralty analysts attempted to correlate these anomalies with known U-boat deployments, but the gaps in intelligence left their assessments inconclusive. Reflecting on these early entries provides a modern lesson about wartime uncertainty. Naval officers worked with incomplete information, often interpreting ambiguous data under immense pressure. In such an environment, even routine encounters could appear extraordinary. What stands out today is not the suggestion of a hidden enemy strategy, but how carefully crews documented what they did not understand, a testament to the discipline and training behind every British patrol. The part closes with one final detail from March 1940, a short, red-penciled annotation in the margin of a report from HMS Vimy. Positioned beside an irregular contact entry, it reads simply, "Unresolved. Refer to operations." The note is unsigned. No follow-up document has ever been located. It is here, in these quiet ambiguities, that the first of the 5 buried secrets begins to emerge, an unresolved fragment that hints at wider gaps within Britain's early war naval intelligence efforts, and a question that would linger as the Battle of the Atlantic intensified. In the winter of 1944, as the war in Europe reached a critical turning point, a little-known directive quietly circulated through the offices of the U.S. Army Air Forces at RAF Mount Farm in Oxfordshire. It called for a new series of reconnaissance flights, missions that would penetrate deeper into Germany than anything attempted before. While the public saw bombers filling the skies over Europe, few knew that the success of those raids depended on the work of small, unarmed aircraft that flew alone, fast, and unseen. These were the men of the 7th Photographic Reconnaissance Group, operating cameras instead of guns, and secrecy instead of glory. Their aircraft, modified P-38 Lightnings known as F-5s, carried some of the most advanced aerial cameras in the world. K-17s and K-22s capable of capturing entire cities from 30,000 feet. But in early 1944, as the Allies prepared for Operation Overlord, planners demanded far more precise intelligence. They needed imagery of Germany's industrial heart, its steel mills, synthetic fuel plants, and railway junctions. And so, the directive for what would become 5 classified flights was issued, marked simply, restricted for intelligence purposes only. 4 pilots of the 7th PRG. The challenge was enormous. The Ruhr Valley was among the most heavily defended regions on Earth. Clouds of smoke from factories and anti-aircraft bursts often merged into an indistinguishable haze. Pilots described it as flying into a black storm that moved. The Luftwaffe's radar network, Freya and Würzburg systems, coordinated with gun crews, ready to track anything that dared cross the Western German frontier. Yet on February 3, 1944, just before dawn, the first classified flight prepared for takeoff. Ground crewmen worked in silence, fastening film magazines the size of small suitcases into the aircraft's bay. Lieutenant Harold Sanderson, assigned to aircraft Blue Arrow 3, wrote a single line in his pocket notebook before climbing into the cockpit: "Speed is our only weapon." He could not have known it would be his last recorded words. At 6:22, paired with 2 other F-5s, Sanderson lifted off into a rising fog. Their orders: penetrate German airspace north of Aachen, descend to 27,000 feet and photograph Essen, Gelsenkirchen, and the surrounding industrial corridors. The trio flew radio silent as per standing protocol. Any transmission could reveal their position. Only under attack were they permitted to break silence. The struggle began long before reaching the Ruhr. Jetstream winds at altitude battered the Lightnings, pushing them miles off course. Icing formed around air intakes. Sanderson's last transmission, brief, static-filled, reported minor engine fluctuations. The other pilots later testified that he remained in formation until they hit the outskirts of Essen. Then within seconds he vanished into a thick column of industrial smoke rising from the Krupp steelworks. Historically, aircraft were lost in this region with disturbing frequency. German radar could vector fighters with remarkable precision. Flak batteries, some manned by teenage Hitler youth, created overlapping kill zones. But what troubled Allied intelligence was the total absence of wreckage. No crash site. No parachute sightings. No captured pilot reported through Red Cross channels. In a memo from 8 Air Force headquarters dated February 6, an intelligence officer noted, "Loss of Blue Arrow 3 unexplained. Possible interference with navigation equipment. Recommend further monitoring of German electromagnetic activity." At the time, few understood how advanced German radar jamming and beam deflection research had become. Even fewer knew that engineers at Peenemünde were experimenting with passive detection systems capable of tracking aircraft by their engine heat signatures. The loss shook the squadron. Recon pilots operated in isolation. Their missions lacked the safety of large bomber formations. Still, to have an entire aircraft vanish without a trace troubled even the most seasoned flyers. One pilot, Lieutenant Charles Radley, later recalled, "We accepted risk. What we couldn't accept was mystery." Yet the mission continued. The photographs brought back by the remaining 2 aircraft were extraordinary. Rail yards around Gelsenkirchen showed intensified activity. Synthetic fuel plants revealed expanded defenses. These images helped shape bomber strategies in the lead-up to Overlord. But they also raised questions. Had the Germans anticipated the flight? Had they developed a new interception method? Or had Sanderson simply succumbed to the dangers of a region that consumed aircraft like a machine? Modern historians often point to the chaotic conditions of early 1944. Weather patterns, German jamming efforts, and mechanical vulnerabilities all played a role in reconnaissance losses. But the disappearance of Blue Arrow 3 still stands out for its completeness. No debris, no body, no closure. As the Allies prepared the second classified mission, the squadron operated under a quiet tension. Something had happened over Essen, something no briefing had prepared them for. And while the photographs from the first mission were invaluable, the unanswered questions weighed heavily on every pilot. The war demanded they continue. The mystery demanded they look deeper. and the second mission would only intensify that unease. In March 1944, with the loss of Blue Arrow 3 still unresolved, Allied intelligence grew increasingly concerned about Germany's ability to predict or counter deep reconnaissance flights. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, had demonstrated moments of uncanny precision when intercepting lone Allied aircraft. And so, when a second classified mission was proposed, this time targeting Germany's critical east-west rail corridors, the stakes felt higher. Recon crews at RAF Mount Farm understood that intelligence gaps could cost thousands of lives, but they also knew something was happening in German airspace that they didn't yet understand. The second classified flight was scheduled for March 12, 1944. Its objective: capture photographic coverage of rail lines feeding divisions to the Eastern Front. Reports from the Soviet side indicated that German armored formations were shifting in unusual patterns, and Allied planners desperately needed to confirm whether these troop movements would eventually reinforce the Western Front. The task fell once again to elements of the 7th Photographic Reconnaissance Group, flying fast, sleek F-5 Lightnings stripped of guns to increase speed and altitude. This mission's lead pilot, Captain David Leroux, was known for his calm under pressure. He had survived flak bursts over Regensburg, a near collision over St. Nazaire, and a close encounter with a pair of Bf-109s that left shrapnel embedded in his fuselage. In his diary he wrote, "We fly alone but never unwatched. The Germans always seem to know when we cross the line." His words would become eerily prophetic. The flight launched at 8:11 under crisp, clear skies. Leroux led 2 other pilots on a route designed to enter Germany north of Liège, cut horizontally across the country, and exit toward the Baltic before turning west. Analysts believed this irregular flight path would disrupt any predictive patterns the Germans might track. But as the aircraft crossed into enemy territory, the struggle began almost immediately. Ground observers later confirmed that German radar stations along the Rhine activated within minutes of the Lightning's arrival. Freya stations tracked them at extreme distance, and Würzburg units began narrowing in for a firing solution. Yet what surprised Allied intelligence was the speed of the Luftwaffe's response. Leroux, maintaining radio silence, watched contrails forming far below, Me-410s climbing fast in a coordinated pincer movement, as though the Germans had been waiting. Still, the Lightnings pressed on. Their objective was the city of Kassel, a major transport hub feeding divisions toward Ukraine and Belarus. To photograph the intricate rail yards, Leroux descended several thousand feet, dangerously low for an unarmed aircraft. Anti-aircraft fire erupted almost instantly. He banked hard, avoiding bursts that came so close he later described hearing the shrapnel scrape the underside of his wings. Despite this, the cameras kept rolling, mile after mile of track, sidings filled with fuel tankers, repair depots, and long freight trains headed east. The images they captured would later become vital intelligence. But the mission was far from complete. On the return path, the Luftwaffe finally reached them. 2 Me-410s gained altitude and closed from behind. Recon pilots were taught never to engage in evasive maneuvers unless absolutely necessary. Any sudden turn could blur the photographs or damage the camera mounts. But with fighters bearing down at high speed, Leroux broadcast a single coded transmission, breaking radio silence, condition amber. It meant, enemy contact, defensive action required. The chase that followed was brief but harrowing. Leroux pushed his F-5 past recommended speed, diving into a thin layer of cloud to break visual pursuit. The other 2 pilots scattered, each diving in a different direction. The Me-410s followed one aircraft, Lieutenant Reeves, whose photographic canister later returned crushed, either from a sudden maneuver or near-miss shrapnel. Reeves managed to escape, but the damage left half his mission's imagery unreadable. When the 3 Lightnings regrouped over Allied-controlled airspace, something became clear. The German interception had been too well-timed, too coordinated. Intelligence officers combing through mission records noted that the Luftwaffe fighters had launched well before the Lightnings reached Kassel. It suggested the Germans were anticipating the flight rather than responding to it. This question dominated the debrief. Some officers speculated about pattern recognition. The Germans might have learned the habits of Allied recon units. Others believed new radar capabilities were at play. A classified memo dated March 13 noted, possible development of passive tracking technologies. Recommend further study. The idea that the Germans could track aircraft by engine heat signatures seemed far-fetched at the time, but future research would show they were closer than the Allies realized. Leroux, reviewing the damaged camera canister from Lieutenant Reeves' aircraft, remarked, "The film tells the story, but it can't tell how they found us." The tension across the unit deepened. 2 missions, and in both cases the Luftwaffe had responded with uncanny precision. And still unexplained was the fate of Blue Arrow 3, whose disappearance overshadowed every new sortie. As preparations began for the third classified flight, one targeting the shadowed forests hiding Germany's new V-2 rocket program, questions from the first 2 missions lingered. The crews sensed it. Intelligence sensed it. Something inside Germany was changing, and the next mission would bring them even closer to it. By mid-April 1944, Allied intelligence confronted a growing fear. Somewhere inside Germany, shadowed beneath forest canopies and camouflaged with extraordinary skill, new V-2 rocket facilities were coming online. The existence of these launch sites had been suspected for months, but their exact locations remained elusive. Every missing detail risked giving Germany a powerful new strategic weapon capable of striking London with little warning. And so, a third classified reconnaissance mission was authorized, one focused on the dark, pine-covered regions stretching from the Baltic coast toward Piedmont. It would become one of the most dangerous flights the 7th Photographic Reconnaissance Group ever attempted. The briefing, held at 4:30 inside a dimly lit Nissen hut, described the stakes with unusual bluntness. Aerial analysts believed the Germans had adapted their launch facilities, dispersing mobile platforms and hiding them under dense forest. This meant the pilots would need to fly lower than usual, below cloud cover, where flak and small arms fire were far more lethal. Major Thomas E. Harriman, leading the mission, looked over the weather report and muttered, "This isn't recon. It's threading a needle in a hurricane." Still, the crews prepared their F-5 Lightnings with the precision of surgeons. Extra fuel tanks were fitted. Camera bays were checked twice. The K-22 high-resolution cameras were calibrated for oblique angles, optimized to capture objects partly concealed by trees. A mechanic remembered Lieutenant Alan Whitford flying the aircraft designated Sundial 7, running his hand along the wing before takeoff, as if memorizing its lines for the last time. The aircraft launched at 6:54, climbing into a ceiling of low, shifting clouds. Almost immediately, the struggle began. A cold front moving in from the Baltic produced violent turbulence, slamming the Lightnings up and down like ships in heavy seas. Harriman considered aborting, but the urgency of the intelligence request, and the pressure from high command, left little room for retreat. They pressed on. Crossing the German coastline near Greifswald, the pilots descended to approximately 15,000 feet, skimming beneath the lowest cloud banks. Below them, dark forests spread out in vast, uninterrupted blankets. Somewhere in those trees, Allied analysts believed, were concrete pads, fueling stations, and mobile launch ramps for the V-2s, slender, deadly rockets that had already caused deep alarm in Washington and London. For nearly 20 minutes they saw nothing. No vehicles. No structures. No clearings. Harriman later wrote in his mission log, "The Germans had turned the land itself into camouflage." But then, a break in the canopy. Through his viewfinder, Whitford caught sight of faint geometric shapes, something that did not belong in the natural forest pattern. He banked sharply, snapping a series of oblique photos. The formations were almost invisible from above, but from a side angle their artificial edges betrayed them. 2 rectangular plots, each containing elongated shadows consistent with launch ramps. As Whitford circled for another pass, the forest below erupted. Flak batteries, hidden in earthen pits, opened fire with startling accuracy. Black bursts filled the air around him. One blast rocked his aircraft so hard that his cockpit canopy cracked. Harriman, flying a few hundred yards away, could see the damage. He radioed a terse warning, breaking strict silence, "Sundial 7, climb and exit west." But Whitford didn't respond. Instead, he made the decision every squadron feared. He completed a second photographic run. The images he captured in those moments, later developed at Mount Farm, would provide the first clear confirmation that Germany had relocated portions of its V-2 infrastructure. But he would not escape. As flak intensified, the cloud cover above suddenly thinned. A clearing opened, just for a moment, and Harriman saw Sundial 7 climbing away from the trees. Then, without warning, it jerked sideways. No explosion. No fire. No smoke. Just a violent, unnatural tilt, like a puppet pulled sharply by one string. The aircraft slid into the clouds and vanished. Harriman called again. No reply. The other pilot on the mission, Lieutenant Maurer, scanned the sky for debris. Nothing. No falling metal. No parachute. No fire. The aircraft had simply entered the cloud bank and never emerged. Back at Mount Farm, the debrief was somber. Whitford's film, miraculously intact and recovered from Harriman's aircraft. He had taken copies during the second pass, confirmed Allied fears about mobile V-2 platforms. Yet everyone in the room kept returning to the same question. How had Whitford vanished with such completeness? Historians later debated several possibilities. A catastrophic mechanical failure. A direct hit from a flak burst too small to produce visible flames. Or perhaps, as some intelligence officers speculated in a classified internal memo, a sudden hit from an experimental German anti-aircraft device. The Germans had been testing new proximity fuses, crude but potentially lethal. What remains certain is that no wreckage was ever found. The region was heavily patrolled after the war, but no trace of Sundial 7 surfaced. As one post-war analyst wrote, "To lose a man is tragedy. To lose a man and his machine to silence, that is something else entirely." The mystery left the squadron uneasy. 2 vanished aircraft in 3 missions. 2 disappearances with no debris, no bodies, no signals. And as preparations began for the 4th classified flight, one tied directly to the D-Day landings, the sense that something was quietly, systematically tracking them grew harder to ignore. By late May 1944, the countdown to the Allied invasion of France had entered its final, secretive phase. Every branch of the military worked under a cloak of silence, and the pressure to secure accurate intelligence was immense. In this tightening atmosphere, the 4th classified reconnaissance mission was approved, one designed to determine whether Germany was repositioning its armored divisions in anticipation of the coming assault. Yet this flight carried an additional quiet purpose: to understand whether the mysterious losses of Blue Arrow 3 and Sundial 7 were coincidental, or part of a hidden German capability that Allied intelligence had not yet fully grasped. The briefing took place on May 30th inside a heavily guarded war room at RAF Mount Farm. Maps of northern France and western Germany covered the walls, marked with colored pins showing recent Luftwaffe movements and suspected tank concentrations. Major Harriman, still shaken by Whitford's disappearance, attended only as an observer. The mission itself would be flown by 2 new pilots, Captain Roy Ellison, a meticulous flyer known for precision turns, and Lieutenant Marcus Dale, a quiet pilot who rarely spoke but had a reputation for extraordinary situational awareness. Their assignment was deceptively simple: fly into Germany just south of the Ruhr, then sweep across the Ardennes region, an area dense with old-growth forest and rolling hills that offered perfect concealment for armored units. These forests, the planners warned, had historically hidden everything from medieval armies to modern mechanized divisions. If the Germans were preparing a response to the inevitable Allied landings, evidence would be here. The struggle began almost immediately after takeoff. Heavy cloud cover forced both pilots to fly at roughly 18,000 feet, low enough to risk interception, high enough that visibility of the ground fluctuated unpredictably. Cold rain streaked the canopies. At times, the clouds formed walls, forcing Dale and Ellison to slip sideways into narrow gaps, rationing every moment of clear sky to capture usable images. Crossing into German airspace, they descended to 15,000 feet as patches of forest began to appear through the thinning mist. The Ardennes were quiet, too quiet. Roads were empty. Fields showed little movement. But both men knew that German armor rarely advertised its presence. The Wehrmacht had perfected the art of the ghost column. Tanks moved at night, concealed under camouflage nets by day, often hidden in ravines or under natural cover. Ellison spotted the first sign of activity at 9:47. Through his camera bay he observed long tracks carved into damp soil, broad, parallel impressions unmistakably shaped by the treads of heavy panzers. A few minutes later, Dale found more: a cluster of support vehicles hastily parked in a clearing. Fuel drums lay scattered around them. The presence of Tiger and Panther units seemed increasingly likely. But as they made a second pass, something changed. The forest below erupted with movement. Camouflage tarps rippled, crews scrambled, and shapes began shifting beneath the trees, armor, heavy armor, prepared to move. Dale captured a sequence of photographs that would stun analysts. At least 2 Panther tank columns concealed in the shadows, engines warming. The photographs would later help Allied planners predict German counterattacks following the D-Day landings. Then came the interception. At 10:04, Ellison reported faint radar chatter in his headset, a rare occurrence for an F-5, whose stripped-down electronics typically produced little noise. Moments later, trails appeared in the distance, aircraft contrails rising fast from an airfield near Koblenz. These were likely Bf-110 night fighters assigned daytime duties due to Allied air superiority. But what was strange was their trajectory. They climbed not toward the most logical interception point, but directly into the flight path Ellison and Dale were already following. It was as though the Germans knew exactly where the two recon planes were heading. Dale's voice broke radio silence. "Bogies closing. Bearing 185. Ellison acknowledged, then banked sharply westward, beginning the escape route drilled into every recon pilot. Their only defense was speed, no guns, no escort. Just the twin booms and powerful engines of the F-5 Lightning. The chase that followed was tense and fast. The Luftwaffe fighters closed to within a dangerous distance, but the Lightnings had altitude advantage. Ellison dove into a cloud bank, emerging through a gap seconds later. Dale did the same at first. Then the cloud swallowed him. Ellison called once, twice. No reply. The Luftwaffe fighters broke off, possibly due to fuel limitations, and Ellison continued his escape, shaking with adrenaline. Breaking through the last of the cloud cover, he scanned the sky behind him, searching for his wingman. Nothing. No smoke. No debris. No radio transmission. No visual trace in the sky. Dale had vanished as suddenly and silently as Whitford before him. Back at Mount Farm, analysts gathered around the film, astonished by the images Dale had captured in the final seconds of his mission. But every conversation eventually returned to the same haunting question. How did yet another aircraft disappear inside cloud cover, without a single sign of destruction? Some suspected an engine failure. Others blamed flak hidden beneath the trees. But a few intelligence officers raised a more unsettling possibility. The Germans might have deployed an advanced form of radar vectoring, something that allowed fighters to approach through cloud banks with precision. Yet nothing could be proven. Dale simply ceased to exist. As D-Day approached, the surviving pilots prepared for a fifth and final classified flight, one whose findings would unexpectedly foreshadow the largest German offensive of the war. In the tense days following the D-Day landings of June 6, 1944, the weight of the entire Allied campaign pressed heavily on intelligence units across Europe. Though the invasion had succeeded, the question haunting every command center was simple and terrifying. How fast could Germany mobilize a counterstrike? To answer this, the fifth classified U.S. recon flight was ordered, one intended to map the movements of German armored divisions scrambling toward Normandy. It would prove to be one of the most consequential missions of the war, and one of the most dangerous. The briefing took place in a sealed operations hut on June 11th. The mood was different now, no longer the uneasy anticipation of earlier missions, but the raw urgency of war in motion. Across northern France, Allied troops fought to expand the beachhead. Reports suggested large German armored formations, including elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the 116th Panzer Division, were redeploying westward. Their arrival could devastate the fragile invasion lines. "We need to know where the hammer is coming from," one intelligence officer said, tapping a map of Normandy with the blunt end of a pencil. This job fell to Captain William "Bill" Mercer, a veteran of more than a dozen deep penetration recon flights. Mercer was known as a steady hand, a pilot who wasted no movement and never gave in to panic. His wingman for the mission would be Lieutenant Everett Vaughan, a newer pilot but sharp-eyed and calm under pressure. Their orders were clear: fly deep into France, identify armored columns, photograph rail and road movements, and return without engaging. The two F-5 Lightnings lifted off shortly after dawn, climbing through a layer of thin fog that still clung to the English countryside. The struggle began as soon as they crossed the French coastline. The region was a patchwork of chaos, burning vehicles, scattered German units, and smoldering towns caught in the path of the invasion. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from nearly every direction. Smoke from burning fuel depots mixed with the morning haze, creating a gray wall that forced both pilots to adjust altitude again and again. Still they pushed inland. Over the region near Argentan, Mercer spotted the first clue: a long dust plume rising from a distant road. As he descended, the unmistakable shapes came into view: Panther tanks, at least a dozen, moving in disciplined formation. Vaughan documented the column in a sweeping photographic pass, capturing crisp images that would later guide Allied bomber strikes targeting German reinforcements. Continuing eastward, they found more. On a rail line near Alassa, a flatbed train loaded with armored vehicles sat idling beside a wooded area. Nearby, a collection of heavy half-tracks and fuel trailers was parked under camouflage netting. Mercer banked hard and took another set of photographs. The scale of German movement was larger than anyone had predicted. But success brought danger. As the two Lightnings turned back toward friendly territory, Mercer was the first to notice faint, fast-moving shadows below the cloud line. "Possible bandits, 2 o'clock low," he transmitted, breaking the radio silence protocol. Moments later, the attackers surged upward. Luftwaffe night fighters, likely Bf-110s, pressed into daytime duty out of desperation. The speed of their ascent was alarming. Mercer shouted, "Break left." Vaughn rolled right. The fighters split into pairs, each pursuing one Lightning. What followed was a desperate high-speed chase across the French countryside. With no guns on board, the U.S. pilots relied on altitude and engine power, pushing the Lightnings to their limits. Mercer dove into a shallow valley and climbed back up in a tight arc, trying to lose his pursuers. Vaughn, a few miles southwest, dove through a cloud bank so violently that one of his camera mounts snapped loose, damaging the film canister. A burst of tracers ripped past Mercer's canopy. He banked again, heart pounding, scanning for any hint of safety. At last, after nearly 5 agonizing minutes, the German fighters broke off, likely low on fuel or wary of venturing too close to Allied airspace. Vaughn reappeared on the radio, shaky but alive. But Vaughn's aircraft was heavily damaged. Fuel leaked from a ruptured tank, instruments flickered, and his right engine coughed intermittently. Mercer guided him toward the nearest Allied-controlled strip, a hastily secured field in Normandy still littered with debris from previous fighting. Vaughn's landing was violent. His F-5 came in low, clipped the top of a hedgerow, and slammed onto the dirt runway, skidding sideways before coming to rest in a cloud of dust. Ground crews sprinted toward him. Miraculously, he survived with only minor injuries. The camera canisters were pulled from his aircraft immediately and rushed back to England for development. What the film revealed stunned analysts. Multiple armored divisions moving with coordinated precision toward the front lines. These images, combined with Mercer's photographs, were used to redirect bomber groups and slow the German advance, buying the Allies precious time during the initial push inland. But a darker revelation overshadowed the mission. Shortly after landing, Vaughn overheard mechanics talking about the 3 earlier disappearances: Blue Arrow 3, Sundial 7, and Dale's aircraft from the previous mission. "They vanished," one mechanic said quietly. "Just like that. No trace." Vaughn later recalled a chill running through him, not from the near-death chase, but from the realization that something systematic seemed to be happening to his squadron. As Mercer prepared for debriefing, he paused at the map table. The lines of German movement, the growing frequency of their interceptions, and the increasing coordination of their responses all pointed to one conclusion. Germany was preparing something larger than the Allies had anticipated. And the 5th mission's images, when studied more closely, would contain clues that foreshadowed the greatest surprise of all, the coming storm in the Ardennes.